Nonviolence section. The Repression of the Sepoys. War or policing operation. Considered the lesser evil in 1848, the political and moral dilemmas re-emerged in a more acute form 9 years later. In India, the Sepoys, Indian soldiers enlisted by the colonial power, unleashed a savage, indiscriminately bloody rebellion, which was followed by a no less ferocious repression marked, in fact, by more systematic cruelty. Giving distinguished expression to one-sided indignation at the horrors of the mutineers was Tocqueville, for whom India's relapse into barbarism would be disastrous for the future of civilization and the progress of humanity. The model country of the West at the time was therefore called upon to act energetically to restore public order in the colony. Quote, "In our day, virtually nothing is impossible for the British nation, as long as it commits all its resources and all its willpower." End quote. The dominant mood in the West also had an influence on the American Peace Society. The majority argued as follows. Even if Britain's rule in India was illegitimate in its origin, the rulers were under an obligation to maintain order and enforce respect for it. In other words, the rebels were wrong to resort to violence, to violate the legal norms in force, and to act as outlaws and criminals in the final analysis. Hence, this was not a war, but a confrontation between common criminality and the forces of order. Support for the latter did not compromise the pacifist cause, which was the cause of a movement that had risen with the task of fighting against war in the strict sense, i.e., wars between states. This might seem to be a repetition of the attitude adopted in 1848. Indeed, there is an element of continuity. In the first case, civil wars, revolutions, are glossed over, while in the second it is wars waged by dominant colonial powers. At the same time, we must not lose sight of the large element of discontinuity. Albeit reticently, 9 years earlier, the revolutionary movement had been regarded favorably, whereas there was now open, professed support for the forces of repression. Whereas in 1848, support, albeit hesitant and elliptical, had been extended to the revolution promising perpetual peace, now the general principle of nonviolence concentrated its fire on the violent rebellion of the oppressed, without even criticizing the brutal manner in which order was restored. It was no coincidence if a painful breach occurred. The sister society that had been formed in England, the London Peace Society, did not identify with the attitude of the American Peace Society and, dissociating itself, did not hesitate to speak of war in connection with the conflict in India, and hence to condemn the British government's violence as well. In fact, the denunciation was now principally focused on the unbounded cupidity and ambition of the colonial power. Its shameless aggressions, its attempt to govern India by the sword, and the degradation of 150 millions of people. So while part of the pacifist movement refused to subsume repression of the rebellion under the category of violence, the other part disdained recourse to this subterfuge. Yet while it professed to condemn the various forms of violence practiced by both parties to the conflict, the London Peace Society actually ended up ranking them and pointing the finger primarily at colonialist violence. The attitude towards the catastrophe adopted by Marx was not very different. While recognizing that the insurgents had been responsible for horrific acts, he mocked the one-sided moral indignation indulged in by the bards of colonialism and superior Western civilization. Quote, "However infamous the conduct of the Sepoys, it is only the reflex, in a concentrated form, of England's own conduct in India." End quote. The British continued to ruthlessly wield power of life and death, and in their correspondence frequently boasted of their infamies. End of section.